Good evening. I'm happy to introduce Brad Jones, who assumed the position of Director of the THC Archaeology Division and Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer in November of 2019 after serving 10 years as the Archaeology Division's Collections Manager, the Curatorial Facilities Certification Program Coordinator, and as Project Reviewer. He received his bachelor degree in anthropology in 1996 from the University of Texas at Austin and a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Illinois in 2004. Highlights of his work have included work in the Cusco Valley and in Texas, collections management and cultural resource investigations. We're very happy to welcome him tonight as he discusses with us the history of Weber's Prairie. Thank you, Brad.
Well, thank you, and good to see those of you who could make it and have power. I'm used to doing this on a stage, so if I seem vaguely uncomfortable, it's because I'm gesticulating wildly off screen, and it's all part of the show, but you just don't get to participate in it tonight. Like I said, I really appreciate coming down and getting an opportunity to talk to y'all's society. And so tonight I'm going to talk about the archaeological history of Weber's Prairie. Kind of move us along here. I'm going to try to move us along here. Oh, there we go. All right, so let's start out with where Weber's Prairie is. Weber's Prairie is here in Travis County, where I'm currently at. Weber's Prairie is the original name of this area, and that's what I'm going to use throughout the talk, but it's known to most people nowadays as Weberville. Close in here a little bit. You can see on the screen, Weberville is located pretty much right between Austin and Bastrop on what was the old road that connected them. It's right along the Colorado River. You probably can't appreciate that very much in this particular slide. Let me close in a little bit more. On a topographic map, kind of zooming down in the area we're talking about. You can see this red circle on here. I think my point, does my pointer show on this screen? Sorry to ask. Now it does.
Okay, we can see it now.
Okay, great. So this red circle just kind of delimits the area. The little community of Weberville is down here at the bottom. And it's a pretty large area. I think you can appreciate this sort of gigantic blank space here is the prairie itself. And you can see that the community of Weberville is located right along the Colorado River. And then it has a large floodplain area that then goes up to a rising upland up here. Kind of show you, this is what it looks like on the ground if you're standing in the plain and you're looking to the north and you can see the upland ridges above you. So this is Weber's Prairie. You can see, at least in this picture, it's currently agricultural land, a lot of it. And you might wonder why I'm talking about this. It was not necessarily by choice. Back in 2008, I was working as a contractor for Hicks & Company, a private cultural resource management firm here in Austin. And we got a contract to investigate a 2,800 acre tract of land owned by the city of Austin. If you'll think back to that topo map I showed you, it covers a lot of the plain area as well as a lot of the upland above it. And in this image, you can see these blue lines on here, and what they're indicating are the original parcels that were set out in 1827 by the Mexican government and ultimately occupied by Anglo settlers associated with Stephen F. Austin's colony. The whole purpose of this project at the time was to do an investigation of this 2,800 acre area and determine whether or not there were cultural resources. City of Austin was trying to determine how to use the property. If you Google Weberville in 2008, you'll see one of their, at the time, pretty controversial ideas was to turn that lower floodplain into a garbage dump, which the community did not care for whatsoever. But they wanted us to go out and do a complete cultural resources review of the property and develop a management plan for them so they could better manage this area and plan for the future. So that's what we were asked to do. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is primarily information which is drawn from that survey. It was conducted back in 2009. I was the principal investigator. The report's published in the gray literature, but is available on the Atlas for stewards or people who have Atlas access, and then should be available as a redacted copy at various libraries across the state. But I did want to acknowledge that's where a lot of this research is coming from. I will expand a little bit beyond the area to talk about a few things, but in general, the sites we'll be discussing throughout this evening's program all occur within this red bounded area. All right. So why is it Weber's Prairie? Well, you can see in this original land plat map down here, this tract is, well, this series of tracts right in here are the tracts that are covered by that survey I conducted. And as you can see down here, J.F. Weber is listed as the owner of this tract right above Weberville. And in fact, he was the earliest settler in the Weberville area. John Weber was an immigrant from Vermont, quite a different landscape and environment he moved into. But the area was originally platted in 1827, sort of finalized in 1830, and it's a little unclear, but by 1833, we know that John Weber and his family were occupying and living on the property as the first, Anglo settlers of this portion of the Colorado River, right between, like I said earlier, Bastrop and Austin. And you can see again the road here illustrated down on the bottom is the old Bastrop to Austin Road, which is basically FM 969 nowadays. Now, John Weber was married to Sylvia Hector. And if you're reading the passage on the screen, it's taken from John Brown's Annals of Travis County. He worked for the county government, and he compiled a really interesting history, which you can read on the Portal of Texas History. They've got it all scanned in there. And he talks about John Weber, and everyone, and we'll talk, Noah Smithwick talks about him, a number of people talked about him as a very upstanding model citizen. But there's a line in here where it's talked about that his sort of what is it called, his unfortunate matrimonial alliance. What was unfortunate and quite controversial at the time is that John Weber, when he moved to Texas, fell in love with John Cryer's slave, Sylvia Hector. But John Weber was able to get her freedom, purchase her freedom from Cryer, as well as her 3 young children, and he married her, and they started their family down here on Weber's Fort. So this is the area and the family from which this property takes its name, and his name has continued on the community of Weberville. I'm going to talk quite a bit about John Weber, but before I do that, I want to sort of take a step back in time and talk about, I want to talk about the whole history of the property. So I want to begin starting with the discussion of the prehistoric and early historic Native American settlement of the property. Obviously, I can't show you guys precise site locations because this is a public presentation, and site locations are protected by archaeological information laws by the state of Texas. But what I wanted to demonstrate here is you can see on the map, this area where I'm circling with my cursor, this is the general area of my survey. And what we found is there were a number of Native American sites, but they were all heavily clustered up on the edge of this upland up here. So this is the yellow area, and I've gone ahead and highlighted all of it because it all pretty much corresponds to the same general geological formation, which is critical about why you see people living here, I think. So here's what it looks like on the ground. This is a transmission line corridor, so they've cleaned away a lot of the trees. And before we started this project, I was aware that previous archaeologists doing corridors like this had indicated there were a number of prehistoric sites spread across these ridges. So this is one of the things we first were interested in looking into, but they didn't define them very well. So we went out, we immediately went back to one of the previously recorded sites. In this case, it's 41 TV 1310. And what we found was a pretty interesting geologic feature. Essentially, that entire upland from Austin to Bastrop is a gigantic Pleistocene gravel bed. They did some geotech boring up there. It ranges from a few feet to 30 feet in depth. And as you can see here, in this pile of exciting rocks I'm circling. This is what a shovel test looked like out there. So this is an 80 centimeter shovel test, and it's essentially gravels and cobbles the whole way down. But what these gravels and cobbles consist of are primarily chert and quartzite. So as you can imagine, for prehistoric peoples, this is just a gigantic quarry site. And what we found was that all along this upland edge, anywhere these gravels are, you find artifacts. Primarily, you can see in the image here, large cobbles, which have been tested often or worked into crude bifaces. I think a lot of that is certainly indication of them testing. From looking at the material that's out there, a lot of the chert is not high quality. Most of it's actually sort of mid to lower quality chert. So you can tell they look at it, they realize it's got a lot of problems, they chuck it. I mean, they're standing on an entire landform at chert. They can find something better. And so, clearly they were probably selecting for better quality material that they found. But I also think one of the interesting things we observed up there are lots of these kind of rough bifaces like this. And I think one of the other aspects we're seeing out here is that obviously to access this material, you can see it's grass, it's dirt right on top, you've got to dig. So I think a lot of these large bifaces that are more finished that we find just on the surface out here are in fact old digging implements. People would have used them to access these gravels. I've given this talk now twice. I'm now challenging any student out there, anybody interested in lithic tool technology, to kind of look at these things. I think you could actually do some use-where analysis and develop a pretty reasonable thesis as to whether or not that's what we're seeing here. But I also want to just kind of draw your attention down here. This is what a creek bed looks like in this formation. Tons of chert. There's just bifaces, tested cobbles everywhere. From an archaeological management perspective, it was a real pain because it's sort of a giant site, but it's not a heavily utilized site. So you will find artifacts, but you're not finding throughout much of this, campsites, the sort of occupations that we might have a lot of interest in terms of preserving and doing further excavation. So let's talk a little bit about that. So in this same zone, we did find a number of what we would call campsites. Not surprisingly, they tend to cluster around springs. So that's one of the other features of this natural upland. In addition to all these abundant lithic resources, you also have a number of streams which have their headwaters that come out in this formation. So what we found was, predictably enough, anywhere there were springs, we found what we would consider larger, potentially temporary or, we assume temporary campsites. And we were able to define them based on essentially a greater diversity of artifact types. Whereas on the uplands where they were clearly quarrying, you're finding large early bifaces, tested cobbles, maybe large primary flakes. When we got into the sites that we felt were truly habitational sites, you began to see a lot more just smaller size debitage representing a full, range of lithic reduction technologies. You began to see more tool types. This one site, which is located on the uplands around one of the larger springs and is quite massive, you can see this was just in one shovel test. We got all sorts of different materials. We were also encountering features buried in these gravels, which I find very strange. It's a little hard to imagine the depositional mechanism which led to them, but they're there nonetheless. So again, even though there's archaeology everywhere, it's possible, looking at the types of assemblages that come off of certain areas, to define what we felt were more traditional campsites. And unfortunately, for all the archaeology we found very little in the way of diagnostic artifacts. So we assume people would have been using these resources for thousands of years, but we only really found conclusive evidence in the archaeology of late Archaic. The single projectile point we found is down there in the photo, which is an Enzer point. You can see there's a little drill and another bifacial base, but we did not find much in the way of diagnostics. So, in terms of temporal determinations, that really would require more archaeology to go back and see. I do want to tell one kind of funny story just about how prolific chert is out there. The site where you can see the larger display of artifacts. One of the old farmers out there who works those lands says that that field often catches on fire because if you use an iron plow, it sparks constantly as they try to plow those fields. So they quit using them for any sort of agriculture. So I thought that was pretty telling about just the prolific nature of chert out there. All right. And I should point out before I move on that, we did look very extensively in the floodplain for archaeological sites. I went out there, we dug 26 backhoe trenches with Charles Frederick. And although there's a potential, we didn't find anything out there. And I think that's for two reasons. One, it becomes a sloppy mess when it rains. It's not a very comfortable place to be. Also, and this was something I hadn't really thought about until I talked to a geographer out there, is that prior to Anglo settlement in this area, the floodplain's all trees. It's pecan, it's all sorts of other resources like that. So I suspect that Native peoples use that bottomland quite differently. And then in addition to the upland where they would settle, they also tended to settle then right on the edge of the Colorado River, which makes a lot of sense. Again, you've got a water source, and then you've got what is essentially, an early superhighway through the state right there. So we do see concentrations of archaeological sites along the river. All right, so let's get to the meat of it. Obviously, this being one of the earliest areas settled in the Austin region, there was a lot of interest when we did this survey in trying to identify these earliest parts of the settlement if they occurred. I mentioned briefly that there was a lot of controversy locally with them putting in a trash dump here. And one of the reasons is there was some belief on the part, and we will talk about this pretty extensively here, that John Weber's house was actually located in that tract of land. Now, what I'm showing you here are some of the main sources I used when I went back to kind of figure out where Weber's original settlement would be. Noah Smithwick, whose memoirs were written down by his daughter in the late 19th century, provides a really great description of Weberville in the 1830s and 1840s. He lived there for a time, said he lived somewhere down from Weber, not real sure where that is. But he describes, as well as Frank Brown, who I mentioned earlier in his Annals of Travis County, as well as this handy Colorado Navigator written in 1839, which is basically a written map down the Colorado from Austin. They all describe the location of Weber's house as being along the river itself. So sorry, I'm not very good with the pointer here because I'm trying to read a second screen, which is kind of across the room for me. But we know that they say repeatedly that he built a block house here. And we also know that Weber opened and operated a ferry. So historically, the assumption has always been that Weber's house is here. We know from all the other accounts that as early as the mid-1830s, a little group of basically a bar and a general store opened up in the area that's marked on here as Hell's Half Acre. The location of this is just described as near the foot of the hills. So I've given an approximation. This was apparently quite the place to go have fun if you were in the around Weber's area. Some gambling, those sort of pursuits. I mean, they didn't call it Hell's Half Acre because it was, well, the church wasn't there, we'll put it that way. In addition, one of the other houses that's mentioned, and I want to bring it up, is the widow Solis's house here. This is outside of our survey area, but in driving along the road every day, we noticed that there was a double corn crib style house off on a private property here. And we think that very possibly this is the widow Solis. When Brown comes through Weberville, he describes going on the old road and describes passing first Hell's Half Acre, Weber's house, and then as they make the curve, the widow Solis's house. I'm trying to work with some of our local stewards and our historical commission here to chase down that as well as some other stuff. But just want to kind of throw that in there as places that we know and have some archaeological interest to either this project or to the general public. There were other people, of course, living here. The Duties lived a little bit to the southeast, so over in this area. And there are a number of other settlers over here that had settled in the region. So like I said, a real big question for us was whether or not any of these sites were located within our survey area. But to complicate matters, as I mentioned in 2008, some of the locals had gone out and identified in this upland area what they believed to be Weber's Fort. I'll come back to that. So archaeologically, let's start with Hell's Half Acre. This is a site that I talk about to basically shame myself. As a younger archaeologist, this is the site I regret in this entire survey. When we went out here, you can see it's basically a flat field. It's currently agricultural land. You can see the backhoe trench down here, just not a very thick topsoil. And in this area, what we found were ceramics, stonewares, whiteware. It didn't look like anything particularly exciting to me. As we'll talk about later, there's a lot of tenant farms. There's a lot of historical material out there. So when I wrote the report, I simply said, it might be the location of Hell's Half Acre, but I think it's more likely than not a late 19th, early 20th century site. It's not significant. I since did more research and learned more about ceramics, and I learned that essentially the ceramics I was looking at, it isn't that they couldn't be late enough for the time period I thought, but I didn't understand how early they began. So in retrospect, I now actually think what in the report is speculated to be Hell's Half Acre probably is the location based on the combination of the archival and my re-review of the ceramic. So it does, however, not make for a compelling archaeological site. Unfortunately, there's not a lot to see. They were probably out here 10 years at the most, and it was probably easier to reuse materials from this site, so I suspect that it was essentially dismantled over time and has left almost no archaeological trace, unfortunately. There is the potential. You can see the site has a weird half moon shape. That's because I was constrained there on the east by private property. Hopefully sometime in the future we'll be able to go out and maybe work with the private property owners and see if there's some more compelling evidence out there, but that remains to be seen. So let's talk about 41 TV 2261. So this site back in 2008 was identified by former UT anthropology professor Claude Bramblett, as well as some local volunteers, and including our former THC regulatory review head, Mark Denton. They found it on one of the upland ridges overlooking the plain. And in the original descriptions, they saw what they believed to be two mounds with a division in between them. They interpreted this to be the foundations of another one of these two like dog trot style houses. Based on some of the stuff they could see on the surface, including you can see here a cistern. This is the mound. And just some of the early brick, they speculated that this site, as the only significant historical site that had been found archaeologically in the area, was likely to be Weber's Fort. Now, again, Weber's Fort, as I told you, multiple historical accounts had placed it right on the river. In addition, they talk about it as a blockhouse, which doesn't quite comport with the description that the people who identified this site thought. But nonetheless, we went out and one of our high priorities was to go revisit this site and investigate it and determine whether or not it was Weber's Fort. So here's some aerial overviews of the site. This is our site boundary here in yellow. It's pretty large, but you can see down here in this area, what is that? Ultimately, we now know to be a brick foundation and a much denser scatter of archaeological materials. I should point out, in talking about any of these sites, every single historic site here has a prehistoric component as well. So, a lot of this site, the site boundaries a lot larger in part because of prehistoric materials. But we began investigating in this area around here with a number of shovel tests. And I want to draw your attention here. This is a 1940 aerial of the same exact area. And you can see the structure in what was at the time a cleared area. By now this is completely forested. So we began doing some, nice little circle there. So we began testing, and I actually had Mark Denton out there with me. He had to lead me to the site because they had also mapped it on the wrong ridge, and I about pulled my hair out trying to find it, but we did eventually find it. And you can see the mound that they described is clearly a very large handmade brick foundation. You can see there's a lot of bricks scattered on the surface out here. The cistern adjacent is made of the same brick. Has some modern beer bottles in it, so clearly we're not the first people out here. But you can see here the type of brick. This is all a handmade brick. It had these sort of characteristic frogs on the front of it. And once we started looking at the artifacts, we really began to ask ourselves, what is the site we're looking at here? Although there were clearly mid to late 19th as well as early 20th century artifacts coming out, we didn't see a lot of what we considered early, and we saw a lot of what was predominantly later. You can just see some examples here. And then in the course of doing the survey, we stumbled across this headstone, which is pretty sad. It's for James Baylor, son of Albert and Jenny Ann Brown. And he was born in 1857 and only lived 1 year and 4 months. And it's a single grave out by itself, away from the house. When we looked into the archival record, the census data identifies Albert Brown as both a carriage repairman as well as a potential architect. And as we'll talk about, I think ultimately, this was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back for me. I had no more faith that this was Weber's fort. So basically, is it Weber's fort? No. We're able to prove that pretty conclusively, in part because by the 1850s, Weber was gone. Let me talk about that really quick. So around 1850, Weber's marriage to Sylvia Hector and their children were causing a lot of social disruption in this region. By the late 1840s, you were having a lot of people out of the Southeast moving into this area, most of whom were plantation owners, slave owners. So people did not look kindly on John Weber and his wife's relationship. He was unable to school his children in the regular school and hired an independent teacher to come teach his children. The teacher was beaten up and driven off. So eventually by 1850, Weber and his family decided to relocate down to the Rio Grande Valley. So over 1850 to 1853, Weber sold off all of his properties, including his original tract as well as the J.P. Walter tract, which is up above it, much of which went to John Baylor Banks. John Baylor Banks was from the Southeast. He had moved to Texas previously, and he was a large plantation owner. And so he moved out to this area in the 1850s, bought all of Weber's property, and in 1853 actually ultimately platted what became the town of Weberville itself. Banks' first house was said to have been in the location near Weber's house, so we suspect it was down here, but we also know that Banks built himself a second house. And ultimately, probably based on the buildup, not going to be a surprise, that's what this site is. Ultimately, some research in the National Archives uncovered some really fascinating documentation on the house before it was a ruin. It was interesting and difficult to find, in part because this area of Travis County is very far east and used to be Bastrop. So when I was researching this area, I was looking in Travis County, and I should have been looking in Bastrop in the 1940s. But what we found was, fortuitously enough, the house and photos of it. And in it, you can see here again, I've overlaid this photo, the cistern. I'll just kind of go back and do it again. Cistern there, cistern there. Same thing with the edge of the house. This is the brick foundation, and that's it overlaying it. Fortunately, at the time in the 1940s, when this was recorded, they were able to get a history on the house. which confirmed that it had been built by Banks in the 1850s. It is actually known in the record as the Aaron Burleson House because Aaron Burleson later owned it, and we'll talk about that shortly. But this made a lot more sense. Banks came in. He was, like I said, a wealthy man. You can see here the full house in 1840. By this point, it's been abandoned. But you can see it was a very large house. The dual mounds were actually the chimney bases, I think. We've never fully excavated it or excavated it beyond the shovel testing. That's almost certainly what caused the two mounds to form. But it's obviously been clearly picked over. And one of the interesting features of this property that kind of threw us off at first was that as you head away from this site in all different directions, there's piles of brick. And talking to the locals, essentially everybody who's got a barbecue in their backyard has been taking brick from this house for the past 60 to 70 years. So this house is now dispersed across the Weberville community. But you can see where they would pile it up along some of the old roads that went through. Speaking of, I was talking about canoes earlier. I have this fantasy that that's what this is an old canoe down here. I know it's a water trough, but maybe it's a reused canoe. We'll never know, but I find it fascinating. Some other views of the house from the front and from the side. I think it's fascinating as well that this house is abandoned, and yet there's this old car back here and this carriage out front. So they clearly just simply walked away one day. And then there's this picture here of the interior, just showing one of the fireplaces. But Banks not only, built this house, platted Weberville, but he brought with him, he had 30 slaves in the slave census of 1860. Historical documents indicate that he built as well at least 8 houses for his enslaved individuals and possibly other houses for visitors. So in documenting the Banks Burleson house, we were also looking hopefully to find associated sites with this period of occupation. We do think we did find that. On the adjacent ridge across from the house, we found a cluster of brick ruins, including a well and I'm sorry, that's a cistern. And they all cluster along a series of roads that come up from the fields below. Obviously, this is speculation at this point. We were doing archaeological survey, so we haven't had time or the opportunity to go back and do extensive excavations. But it seems likely, based on the type of brick, which matches that which was found at the Banks Burleson house, that these are occupations associated with the plantation period, or at least as early as the plantation period. And on the other adjacent ridge, we found a very similar, not as extensive an amount of archaeology, but we found what may potentially be at least another house over there. This also happens to be the best prehistoric site in the entire place with the best preservation. In addition to those components of the survey property that we looked at dating to that 1853 to 1865 period, we also ran across a small cemetery, or what remained of it. And I'll show you the headstones here in a minute. And they were from the Meeks family. And I just want to show you on this picture, you can see here, this is Weber's property again. And then this is J.B. Walters. Walters never occupied this. It was always controlled and ultimately sold off by Weber. And it was broken into what you see here, which is this little sketch map that I found in the Travis County archives. And so we know that at some point in the 1850s, at least half of the Walters survey was actually owned by a John Meeks. There's not a lot in the records about John Meeks. He may have been sued. That's one of the documents I see. We suspect, based on another Meeks family I'll talk about later, they may have been a small slave-owning family that had property out there. What's interesting and confusing is the site I'm going to show you now, which is this terrible looking situation. You can see these stones in here. We think it's associated with that Meeks family based on the dates of these two headstones. The one on the left, they were born in 1852. We believe they died in the 1870s. But the one on the right here was actually passed away in what is 1852 or 3. It's a little hard to read. So we suspect this may be associated with their occupation of this property. We never found anything associated with the cemetery which suggested there was housing nearby. Um, it's not uncommon in this time period for neighbors to contribute together on a plot of land to bury in. There may be a lot more to the cemetery. You can see it's very heavily damaged. It looks like most of these had been pushed up into the trees. We found a footstone, the 2 headstones. So we don't know, but it may be another part of the occupation that we were unable to really track down for this time period. In 1865, everything changes. Into the Civil War, obviously the plantation economy here collapses. Banks sells his property to Aaron Burleson, at least a large chunk of his property. The rest of the properties in the survey area are sold to basically change hands with a variety of people. Banks himself decides at this point that he needs to move to Galveston, so he leaves the scene. But this is also a period, 1865 to 1905, when you see on here the Meeks farm. This is the other Meeks family I was talking about. This is a Black Meeks family, and we'll talk about their footprint and the archaeology of their family as well. I don't want to dwell too long on Aaron Burleson. There's a lot of Burlesons out there. If you're familiar with Texas history, they pop up everywhere. This particular Burleson is basically commemorated in this painting, which hangs in the Capitol, and it is the surrender of San Jacinto. And you can see here, Aaron Burleson's the one with the rope. I can only imagine what he was thinking about doing with that rope, but there he is. He lived on this property as well as a large property a little bit west of here in Go Valley until the 1870s when he deeded it to his family. At least his children. We don't really know a lot about what Aaron Burleson did here other than he lived here. It appears he may have actually been returned this to pasture land. I didn't say this earlier. Weber doesn't appear to have ever used this property much for agriculture. We believe he used it more for pasture. And obviously when Banks took over and turned it into a plantation, it shifted heavily and it was focused on plantation agriculture, but it looks like during the Burleson period, it reverted back probably to more pasture land. Now, I want to go back to the Meeks. The Burlesons, they're very interesting. They're historically known, but it's a known story. The Meeks farm, on the other hand, is a pretty interesting example of the way freedmen's colonies form in Travis County. Lewis Meeks was, as a freedman in the 1870s, began buying up property, in 1877, began buying up property in a portion of the old Weber and Walter survey. And it looks like he actually bought part of Banks' old plantation. Now, we're not sure who Meeks is, Lewis Meeks. He just kind of shows up in the census records in the 1870s, but he and his family settle out here. And, over time, they actually continue to buy more property. But this is the property we believe is the original homestead. You can see the plan map over here. It's a little awkwardly drawn. The farm itself would have been larger than the boundary, but this is where, again, I was telling y'all earlier, this was for management purposes for the city of Austin. This is where the cultural resources were concentrated and need to be protected. You can see up here this little kind of inset. I made Tarl really mad doing this. That is actually the Meeks Cemetery, the Black Meeks Cemetery. And I thought it would be better to bound it off separately within the site. And they let me do it, but I got a scolding from Tarl on that day. But nonetheless, the Meeks lived here actually until the 1980s. The stayed in the family until they moved to California, and it was bought by the city of Austin. The most obvious habitation is this one, which is the last house which was built, which was a modern home on a concrete plant or a concrete foundation. But we also found what is basically one half of a corn crib. over here made out of logs. It had been converted into some sort of barn. I believe this is probably part of the original house. There was a separate half of it that was found on a later Meeks property. It had clearly been moved. It was set on a concrete foundation. So we think that probably they dismantled part of the house that they hadn't converted to a barn, and they converted it to a barn over at another one of their later properties. But it, unfortunately doesn't have what we consider to likely be primary context. So one of the really kind of cool parts of the site for the Meeks family that we found was what we believe to be the Meeks School. When we first came on this structure, kind of came at it from this direction, you can see it's kind of looks more like a barn. As we began to look at it more closely, you can see there's these, they're basically extensions on the sides. And you can see here it's collapsed, but it looked like originally it would have gone out to produce a covered area. And you can see some shelving and a door back here in the window. And when you go inside, you find what appears to be an office. Once we did some research around there, we kept excavating. We felt like clearly this wasn't a normal barn. Normal barns shouldn't have desks like that. We did the archaeology. We found a lot of evidence of late 19th, early 20th century activity, but we found a lot of pencils, fragments of slate, material like that. Now, I'm setting this up like it's a mystery. It really wasn't. I knew from the 1898 1902 county maps that there was a Meeks school marked in this general location. So this was really nice to be able to match up the maps with this property. So we believe what this is the Meeks Family School, and it would have been probably a school not just for the Meeks children, but some of the other local families. Because what you see out here is that the Meeks were part of a larger dispersed freedmen's colony type settlement. One of the things that research in Travis County has shown kind of over and over again is a lot of the settlement pattern for freedmen is to be intermixed with white and other families. So we see this not only here, but areas over in West Austin, Kinchinville, very much the same thing. You'll have a black family, a white family, a black family, all intermixed. The black community operates much like a traditional freedmen's community and having its own church, its own community, but they're intermixed with other neighbors. Now, I have to tell you guys that I'm very upset with the city of Austin and Austin Energy. They actually, I don't think intentionally, have destroyed this site. It was associated with some trailers and other more modern material that I'm sure presented a hazard and a liability from a lawyerly perspective. But unfortunately, this documentation is all that we have at the site. It would be nice to do some archaeology. There have been a couple of projects here in Travis County which have looked at black schools, and it would be nice to do some comparative analysis at some point in the future. And this is the Meeks Family Cemetery. We were able to define it. It's actually well defined. It's fenced off. The Meeks family used this cemetery up until the late 1980s to bury family members. You can see there the fallen monument down there is actually the original Lewis Meeks headstone and marker. So the family history is played out there. You can see here a little map we made of it, and it's nice, it's protected, but up until we did this survey, this entire cemetery was completely unknown, except perhaps to the Meeks family members. Now, the Meeks family, they persisted, like I said, until the 1980s. Over time, they expanded properties. As the family got bigger, they built new houses. So you can see they kind of expanded up there. Throughout the rest of the property, up here in this area, you get another farmstead, a family farm. Down here, more family farms. And over here, the Dietz family, and we found some evidence of their household. Actually, at the late 19th, early 20th century, created what was called Deatsville at the time, which is a little tiny community on the road. But I don't want to really focus on those for the rest of this talk. I just want to talk about what happened and what was the old Aaron Burleson property. I said that in the 1870s, he basically gave the property to his children. They held on to it through the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. But in 1905, they made a sale to J.B. Maynor. Those of you familiar with the town of Maynor, it's the same Maynor. He came in here and he purchased this tract of land, and it began what would be its 20th century use life is as a series of tenant farms. Maynor operated it until I believe 1928, 1929, and then he sold it to McEachern. McEachern ran this property until the 1980s when finally the city of Austin purchased all of it. They didn't actually, although I'll show you some tenant farms here in a moment, they people continued to live on this property farming up until this point, and they continue the city to lease a lot of this land for agriculture. Now, a lot of it has now become a solar farm. I told you they wanted to build a trash dump. They ultimately built a solar farm in a portion of this property. But this continuation of the agriculture was very beneficial because the people farming it have been doing it for generations. So a lot of what we learned about the tenant farm period comes from Mr. Brown, who farmed the land and knew a lot of these people. So it was really kind of a fun ethnographic oral history opportunity here as well. And so I'm just going to show you some images of these. The tenant homes are very repetitive. They have this basic shape. They have this sort of tar paper type of outside, typically 1 to 2 rooms. They'll have a brick chimney. Really interesting artifacts around them. Obviously, if you like old cars, here's one for you. Lots of bottles, brick. This particular house had a wonderfully preserved outhouse that I somehow or another don't have a photo of. But it was pretty creepy when we went in, and the suits were still on the wall. You can tell that people here were probably bought out and just left. Perhaps they were forced out. We're not really sure. We know that most of the people who were tenant farmers were African American, but a lot of their things were just simply left. And ultimately, we documented 4 of these houses out here, sort of retaining this tenant farm landscape. At least one of them we know to be moved by looking at aerials, and there was probably one other out there that was destroyed. There's just some more images of these type of tenant farms. And again, very similar in construction. Really creepy is probably an inappropriate word here, but finding baby doll shoes on the ground, I don't know, it touches you in a different way than other sites, because you can really sort of feel the people that were here. Again, I still think of that suit and whose it was. So I'm going to wrap this up. I know I'm running out of time. I have come back to this project in part because of other people's work. And I want to talk about that a little bit. But, part of what, after I did this work, ultimately kind of left me fascinated with Weberville and its history is just the changes it went through. As a frontier town, Noah Smithwick talks about it as a place that was actually very open. Weber and Sylvia, or John Weber and Sylvia, were able to settle there because the early pioneers and frontier folk were much more, I think, open and forgiving in many ways than the people that came later. It was, for a time, a community they could live and thrive in. But ultimately, over time, obviously Banks comes in, he purchases it, and, what was once property owned by a white man and his freed slave wife and their family becomes a plantation. People talk constantly about finding Weber's house. I don't think we'll ever find Weber's house. I think Banks, though he commemorates Weber by calling it Weberville, seems to have probably completely just redone the landscape. I suspect Banks demolished Weber's house and we'll never find it. There is potentially something left of his ferry that's owned by a current property owner now, private property owner, which I'm going to go out and look at sometime in the near future. I could be wrong. It could be that there are some archaeological traces of Weber's house, and I'd love to get an opportunity to go out and look. But I think, the landscape was transformed in between Weber's occupation and Banks. And subsequently, it passes to Aaron Burleson, where it retains a lot of its feel. But over time, by the 20th century, Weberville, which has been growing, ultimately starts to decline. Nowadays, Weberville is a very small community, primarily minority population. It's kind of become a real hinterville of Austin, hinterland of Austin. This was part of what caused the uproar, was that Austin saw it as a trash dump, and the people who lived there didn't. So I think what's been interesting is people in Weberville are starting to wake up to their history. I really hadn't thought about Weberville much in the past few years, and then I started talking with folks down in the Rio Grande Valley. I mentioned that in the 1850s, Weber left and went to the Rio Grande Valley, and ultimately he went down and bought tracts of property right on the Rio Grande. This is Weber's cemetery, you can see here. It's basically in Donna, down in Hidalgo County. And over the past few years, there's been a lot of interesting research. Oops, wrong way. By researchers at UT Rio Grande Valley. This is Roseanne Bachagarza with a local informant standing in front of John Weber's headstone. Obviously, that's not the original headstone. It's been replaced. And here in the same cemetery is Sylvia's. Sylvia's family and John's family and their descendants have really had sort of a reawakening in their own recognition of their family. I think for a long time, their past was a burden, but they're starting to really embrace it, in part because in many ways, Sylvia Hector's having her day right now. Oops, golly, I keep doing this wrong. You can see here the Briscoe Center has a new exhibit on freedom papers, evidence of emancipation. Sylvia Weber's story is there. Her emancipation papers are there. And what's become interesting, and I encourage all to look this up, is, and I didn't know any of this until real recently, is John Weber and Sylvia are considered primary actors in the Underground Railroad in Texas. Weber, when he had the ferry in Austin or in Weberville, and ultimately when he goes to the Rio Grande Valley, he opened up a ferry there. So him and his neighbor, who was also a white man married to an ex-slave, are considered to have been critical links in smuggling slaves out of Texas and into Mexico where they could be free. So I think it's really, I don't know, it's just got me really excited about this story. And, it just reminds me archaeology is fun because we often have to interact with history in a way different than historians. And we start looking at things in different ways. And I've been discussing this project now with Roseanne and some other folks down in the Rio Grande Valley to do a collaborative study because they have been showing photos of Weber's Fort as that house up on that hill. And I finally got to them and now they won't anymore. So it's been a great collaborative effort. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I realize it's kind of me reawakening my interest in something. So I admit there's a lot of kind of early thought. Well, shouldn't be early. It was 14 years ago. They're late thoughts coming back to me. So appreciate you listening and happy to answer any questions you'll have.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much, Brad. And we do have some questions in the chat. So here's the first one from Sandy Meredith. Is there any plan to reconstruct Lewis Meek's headstone?
That's a great question. Right now, the cemetery is very safe. So no work has been done at the cemetery beyond recording it. I think that would be a great opportunity to work with the local community. To be really honest, Austin Energy has some liability concerns. So, there'll be some hoops to jump through, but I think it's a really great idea. I'd like to reach out to the Meeks family descendants and see about their interests. But yeah, unfortunately at the moment, no, but we've definitely got some interested folks down here who would like to do something about it.
Wow. Okay. What was the Banks plantation crop?
I believe it was primarily cotton. That's what I've read in the historical documents. I admit I was not that interested in banks. I was interested in Weber. I was interested in the prehistoric settlement pattern. I'm kind of a latecomer to the Banks game. But yeah, I believe most of the plantation crop down there was cotton. There's some beautiful old historic photos of the cotton crops down there being transported up to Maynard. So
What are your observations and opinions about the handmade brick that you were finding?
well, this kind of goes back to another reason why we don't think it was Weber. The labor involved in making that brick is pretty large. So we assume that, banks having 30 enslaved persons had the labor and the capital to actually get this done. They're clearly handmade. I know if that's Tommy Knuckles out there, the frogs are not that common, but they're very characteristic of that particular structure. And I've seen some other 1850s ones with similar frogs. Again, they seem to be, individually mold made and have a lot of the, all the imperfections you would imagine in a handmade brick.
On site, made on site from the clay right there, the mud right there?
They're probably made down on the floodplain. There's good clay down there that's been talked about. So I would suspect down there. I suspect, I showed you guys that area where I thought that there were potentially cabins and things like that up on the slope. I suspect him owning that whole property, he may have had people in different places doing different industries that fall, currently outside of the area I was looking at.
Okay. And then from Sandy Meredith, a really inspiring love story. Did not expect that coming into this meeting, to be honest. Awesome presentation.
Thank you.
And here's another comment. This is a wonderful Texas story, and it would be great to write it up further. Are there such plans?
I never commit myself to writing because I make those promises and then it takes 25 years. The short answer is yes. I'm going to focus first on like a blog, something like that. The other thing is I'm going to get the redacted report up online. Just plug for Index of Texas Archaeology. You can go read redacted archaeological reports up there. So, my first step is just to make this information more widely available. But ultimately, I would like to work with the local stewards and historical commission to do some more research before we really do anything. But yes, I would love to write this history up in a more popular format.
If you ever want to have it published, HAS has publications. Right?
Yep, we have a journal. We'd love
we would love to publish something like this.
Yeah.
Hey, when I was doing a little bit of reading just now while you were talking on Mr. Weber, did he actually live to 100, 102 or something like that?
Well, here's his tombstone right here.
It said he was born in Vermont in the 1880s and he died in 1780s, excuse me. And he died in 1882, if I read that correct.
I'm not going to comment on that without something to reference.
It was, I clicked on an article in the Austin Chronicle and it was talking prior to you. This was like from 20 years ago. It was on Weberville and it was talking about him coming to Texas and da-da-da-da-da. So interesting. Hardly anybody lived that old except Noah Smithwick.
Right. Let's see. I don't see any other questions. Are there any other questions from our audience? Okay. Well, that was really interesting and unusual story, not the usual story. And your work is wonderful. You really uncovered a lot of good information. And we thank you so much.
Very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. And thank you for switching gears on us this week at the last minute. I'm glad we made that decision so you wouldn't have to try to go through floodwaters on the way home if that's what they're dealing with.